Dear Mary, I'm so delighted with our new home. There's no need to go outside for anything, and no detail that makes for comfort and convenience has been omitted. There is even a linen press tucked under the stairs. William only needs to walk to work at the station, and the children are excited to think that our neighbours will be settling in soon. Do come and see us when you are able. Love, Jean.
Mr. and Mrs. W. Johnson were the first homeowners in Garden City and moved into Pullman Street on the 5th of July 1927. Mr. Johnson was the assistant station master at Port Melbourne, and the family had 3 children. The Bankhouse estate was a unique experiment in mass housing, quite unlike anything else in Australia. Initiated by the state government through the State Savings Bank, it was Victoria's first attempt to provide low-cost housing on a single estate. Houses could be purchased for an average price of £1,000. The estate was designed according to the Garden City town planning philosophy, popular in England in the 1920s and 30s. There were semi-detached, single and double-storey houses arranged around a series of public open spaces in a distorted Beaux Arts layout. The bank houses were never public housing, but always in private hands, and the area later became known as Nobbs Hill. This was a reference to the relative wealth of their occupants compared to the residents of the clinker brick public housing that was added later. The Housing Commission area in Fisherman's Bend, first envisaged by the government in 1937, became known as Little Baghdad. Rosalie Bray comments,
I don't think anyone could understand the mindset of people from the Housing Commission estate without any knowledge of the poor conditions that were a way of life for many pre-World War II people. The majority of the new residents had endured many hardships during the Depression from 1929 to 1939, which led to poor housing conditions and poverty. One of my neighbours told me that her family previously lived in a 2-bedroomed house in South Melbourne, where the parents had a bedroom, an uncle slept on the living room couch, and 5 boys shared a double bed in the other bedroom. The kitchen was basic, no hot water or other conveniences. The family was so pleased to move to a Housing Commission house, and it was kept like a little palace.
Rosalie and her mother moved into Gellibrand Road in October 1943, after sharing an overcrowded house in Coburg with her mother's cousins as a result of Rosalie's father falling in the war.
The furniture removalists dumped us in the clinker brick semi-detached house at 32 Gellibrand Road and left. Mum and I looked at each other and cried, partly for joy and also to say, what are we going to do now?
Housing in Port Melbourne has evolved throughout history as the population, with all its complexities, has grown. In 1837, when the first settlers came to Victoria, land was only available for lease as sheep runs and not for purchase. The Sandridge land was leased to Richard Baxter, who was quite a smart man about town but did not ever live in Port Melbourne. The houses were very basic. The first person to camp at the beach, as Port Melbourne was then known, was William Darke, who camped on the edge of the scrub while he made a land survey of the area. He named the area Sandridge. At about the same time, 2 men, Leonard Story and William Davis, lived in an old sugar hogshead, a very large barrel, anchored in the sand close to the present junction of Bay and Beach Streets. They may have been boatmen and fishermen. Little is known of Story, but Davis appears to have been an assigned convict, brought to Port Phillip by Mr. Charles Hutton in 1838. The most famous of the early residents were Wilbraham and Caroline Liarde. The Liardes were not the only family living at the beach in these early days. In 1841, a government census was taken of the Port Phillip district. 7 households were recorded at the beach. 2 were described as hotels and 5 as residences. 17 of the total 53 persons listed were children under the age of 14, so family life was established early at the beach. This painting, by an unknown artist, shows that the few houses built at the beach in the 1840s were scattered in the scrub very close to the waterline. There were already fishermen living in huts above the watermark on the sand dunes. Gradually, houses were built along the track to Melbourne, which became Bay Street. Their houses were no doubt still rather primitive, mostly built with wood cut on the site, and the frame covered with bark, canvas or split boards. However, as the buildings in this sketch show, some were much more substantial. One of the differences between these houses, and most of the ones we live in today, was that the kitchen was outside, separate from the rest of the house, in order to minimise the risk of fire. In the early gold rush days, there was not enough time to accommodate arriving diggers. It is well known that a large tent city was established on Emerald Hill, but many also set up temporary tents for themselves on the beach. This sketch, from 1854, shows the house that stood at the toll gate on the Sandridge Road between Sandridge and Melbourne. By 1859, land sales in Sandridge had allowed the growth of a compact settlement of residential and business premises. At that time, the centre of commercial activity was the corner of Bay and Beach Streets. From the 1840s, substantial buildings replaced the old ramshackle ones as the residents of Sandridge prospered. Just how densely the houses were built can be deduced from the list of properties burned in a disastrous fire that swept this part of Port Melbourne on the 23rd of January 1854. In the block from Beach Street inland, some 60 to 70 houses were destroyed, as well as business premises. The total destruction was valued at £100,000, a lot of money at that time. Very few houses built before 1870 survive intact to the present day, but this general view of Sandridge, taken in 1873, gives a clear picture of the type of housing in Sandridge at that time. Most shopkeepers lived behind or above their businesses. This photo, taken about 1900, is of one such shop house built before 1880. One of the few groups of houses built before 1880 which still survive are Peckham Terrace in Bay Street. The Melbourne land boom of the 1880s, when credit was easily obtainable, laid the foundation for the Port Melbourne townscape that is familiar to us. The occupied boundaries of the old Port Melbourne, previously confined to the area southeast of the railway line, were expanded, and new housing of West Sandridge sprang up between 1880 and 1890. These houses were built between 1885 and 1900, initially to be rented to labourers, including dock workers. Number 129 was first occupied by Thomas Porter and his wife Elizabeth, whose family continued to live in the house until 1960. This is one of the small row of cottages built by Dr. Cruscaden in 1903 on the land where the derelict houses owned by Jane Slavin were demolished. Housing developments have not stopped in Port Melbourne. By the 1980s, the population had decreased significantly as the factories closed and commercial shipping moved to Swanson docks. This was a result of the decommissioning of the Prince's Pier in 1985. The Mirvac residential development of Beacon Cove on the former BP site in Beach Street began in 1995 and helped to shape the population that lives in Port Melbourne today. The first stage of Beacon Cove's development was essentially suburban in type. The second stage had a different urban topology, with individual residential towers along the foreshore. The estate layout is based on a scaled-down Beaux Arts style plan, with most housing arranged around a series of small parks and a hierarchy of axial and circuit streets. The focal point of the estate is centred on a busy mixed-use urban square at the head of Station Pier, containing the Beacon Cove food store, the Light Rail 109 terminus, waterfront restaurants, gym, medical centre and various other businesses.
We have been here at Beacon Cove for just over 16 years. It was the second stage of the development. We were looking to buy closer to town, and this was the first place I liked. There were a lot of empty nesters when we moved in, and it's changed over the time with more young people moving in. I still like living here. Transport is fantastic. We love walks around the beach. My children keep telling us we are never allowed to sell the house.
Imaginative recycling of disused industrial complexes has been a feature of the new wave of housing development. The Sandridge Bay Towers, for example, were built incorporating the old starch factory with its distinctive chimney.
I served my engineering apprenticeship in Port Melbourne in the 1950s, when the area was very working class. In 1991 I was looking for an apartment with sea views when I moved from Eden in New South Wales. Melbourne was going through a recession and Port Melbourne had started the gentrification like many other suburbs. The area was clean and had a feeling of prosperity. I purchased a unit at Sandridge Bay Towers, the old Harper starch factory, and I loved the location and the friendly neighbours.
The former lagoon, now filled in and partially a park, saw the construction of the Beckton apartments in 1999.
We had outgrown the cosmopolitan but noisy lifestyle of our Victorian cottage in South Yarra and started looking for quieter pastures. Port Melbourne was completely new territory to me. I expected it to be rough and ready without much polish. As we drove along the beach and viewed the spirit of Tasmania and all the beach activities in full swing, it felt like a breath of fresh air and has remained so today. I love the mixture of rows of workers' cottages alongside sophisticated apartment blocks. The conversion of many factories into posh living quarters adds great interest. Everyone walks, rides or plays sport and most look happy and healthy. As soon as we walked into the apartment, I said, "This is it."
The next housing wave is expected to be the Fisherman's Bend development. Port Melbourne will continue to grow and house new residents who will stay and say, "They can carry me out."